Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversation Podcast number 42, Reclaiming Our Democracy, a conversation with John Sorensen. As we approach this pivotal election, the very fabric of our democracy is at risk. What happens if we let polarization and misinformation guide our choices? In this episode, John Sorensen joins us as we dissect what's truly at stake. Could we lose our rights, freedoms, and the values that make our democracy thrive? Join us as we dive deeply into the hard questions of who we want to be as a nation and how we preserve the democratic principles we hold dear. In this episode, John Sorensen returns to discuss the state of American democracy in the context of the upcoming election. We explore pressing questions about misinformation, the dangers of polarization, and the necessity for civic engagement. John shares the important work he and Elders Action Network are doing through the Elders for Sound Democracy, focusing on initiatives to protect voting rights, counteract the influence of big money in politics, and support marginalized communities in exercising their right to vote. Together, we challenge the audience to think about the future of our country, the importance of being informed citizens, and why our democracy needs an evolution, a peaceful revolution, to truly reflect the will of the people. Prior to his involvement with Elders Action Network, John ran a successful aerospace business for 20 years, which he sold in 2005. Following this, he embarked on a personal journey, including humanitarian work in Vietnam that profoundly impacted his worldview and led to his commitment to elder activism. We want to thank our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their continued support of this podcast. Their dedication to fostering a resilient and empowered elder community has allowed us to bring these vital conversations to you. We appreciate their unwavering commitment to addressing the most urgent issues of our time, from democracy to climate action. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izu and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, and our producer, Jim Burke, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we explore ideas and issues about the future of humanity and planet, especially from the perspective of those of us over 50, 55, and the contribution that we can make. But as we always say, whatever age or stage you are in your life, we welcome you today to our conversation. So Alain, the conversation we're going to have today is obviously a very timely one. And we felt like, given that the election is just a few weeks away now in the United States, that this would be a good time to step back and talk a little bit, not just about the election, but maybe about our democracy generally. And my favorite founding father is Thomas Jefferson. Now, I know he wasn't perfect by any means, and I often think we have to be careful about judging people about how progressive they were based on our values of this moment versus the values at the time. And for his time, Jefferson, a lot of things were quite progressive about Jefferson, and again, some things he needed to improve. But there's two things Jefferson said about the democracy that I always remember. The first thing he said was that the success of democracy would depend on an informed citizenry. And when I think about that, I think there's first the personal responsibility for us as citizens to be informed about issues and about our government and about what's actually going on around us. And the second thing, of course, is can citizens make good decisions in light of having bad information? And the information age, the internet and social media have really changed the landscape for voters. They get a lot of information, often in the ghetto of their own community of who they believe and follow. So if you're far to the left, you hear only from people who agree with you. If you're far to the right, you hear only from people who agree with you. And then you have the right saying the traditional media is fake news, and then talking about we have alternative facts. But in many ways, it's a problem not just with one side of the argument, but it's a really issue of can we be informed citizens? The second thing that Jefferson said was that for democracy to survive, there would have to be another American Revolution every 20 to 30 years. And he didn't mean, of course, a violent revolution. He meant that the democracy would have to evolve and change. It couldn't stay static. And I think about some of the core issues that are talked about in democracy in America, things like, is the Electoral College obsolete? What's the role of money in politics? Is a two-party system serving us? Is even first past the post a reasonable way to decide? Are term limits a good idea when people often serve in Congress for many years and politics becomes a profession, which our founding fathers, by the way, never imagined there would be full-time politicians because there was no such thing in their day. People had real jobs. They were farmers and merchants and lawyers, and they happened to give part of their time to being politicians. But now it's actually become a job. So we want to talk about this election. It's a consequential election, but we also want to talk about maybe some ways we need to begin to tinker with the democracy itself. So we hope to have some fun with this today, but also respect the fact that we're in this timely moment that we're in. So Alon, I'm excited to kind of have this maybe somewhat freewheeling conversation about this important moment in our democracy.
Thank you, John. Yes, I too am excited, not just because it's a very topical subject at this time with the elections. I happen to be rereading a book called Healing the Heart of Democracy by Parker Palmer, and he did a new edition at the beginning of this year, but it's still text that is 10 years old. And there are so many good questions that he raises, and the habits of the heart that are absolutely needed for a democracy to function. So I'm very eager to get into this conversation with the two Johns.
Yeah, with the two Johns. And I love Parker's work. I haven't read any of his stuff in years. I'll have to engage with that. So welcoming an old friend into the podcast today, John Sorensen. As you heard in the introduction, John is a very cool and influential person himself who, in his retirement from his first profession when he sold his business, went through a transformation. You want to hear that story? You can go back to a podcast we did with him over a year ago now, and founded the Elders Action Network. He continues to be on the board of that organization, as I am as well, and Alon is involved. And I want to make a quick disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast before I welcome the other John in, or maybe I'm the other John, is that while all of us have an affiliation with the Elders Action Network, and John, in fact, is the founder, while we're sponsored by them and Elders Climate Action, they don't financially contribute. The podcast is an independent endeavor of the two of us and our producer, Jim Burke. So we are not speaking today in our roles as Elders Action Network board members or founders. We're really speaking as citizens. And though we may occasionally reference that work, we're not speaking on behalf of the organization today. So John, welcome to the Way Forward podcast studio. Nice to have you again.
Well, it's good to be here. And you guys provided me some wonderful points to consider in talking about our democracy and the election and all of the things that we worry about and wish were different. So I have been looking forward to this. I spent some time thinking about what I would say about certain things, but I also want to make sure that I come across, not scripted here, but free to speak as John Sorensen, United States citizen, worried about the future or whatever. Okay. So thank you.
And maybe that's a great place for all of us to start. What worries us about our democracy in America? I think that'd be a great place to start. So, John, I'll let you go first. What worries you? What's on your list of things you worry about as you think about American democracy?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I have a great love for this country. I'm a son of an immigrant. My father came here with nothing really, and was given the opportunity to thrive in America. And he became a farmer in Iowa, having his own farm. And that to him was a tremendous achievement from where he came from. But part of growing up with that was from him a love of the land, And then my mother had 5 brothers that served in World War II. So from that, I heard, them speaking all the time of our country and what a wonderful place it is. And why aren't we appreciating it more and that sort of thing. So I've been in that mode my entire life. And so what I see going on today of the polarization and the seemingly unrealization of how fortunate we are to live in this land, and the beauty of it, and the idealism that we are maybe sort of brought up with, and saying we could do that. We have the wealth and the wherewithal to really set the example. And so anyway, those are the things that concern me. Why aren't we there? And why are people thinking some people anyway, would rather have an authoritarian kind of government? And those are the things that worry off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking, 2 things came to mind for me. Remember the old phrase that would say, love it or leave it? And I go back to Jefferson, like that's almost antithetical to the spirit of the founding fathers, who said, love it and improve it. So like the founding fathers were not love it or leave it. They were like, love it or improve it. And so I think you remind people that it's not antithetical to loving your country, to think it needs to do better. That's our job as citizens, to be critical of our country. In fact, Declaration of Independence, I was rereading it the other day, and people know the first part. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What they meant, the second part is basically says that we believe in the inherent right of the people to choose a government that will create happiness for them, security and happiness for them, and in the right of people to change that government should that government not produce that. And when you were talking, John, I was thinking, I just heard the other day that, as always, when you ask people the institutions that they admire most in America, Congress is dead last again and again. So people have really lost faith in the very government of the governing ability of the country. And I think that should worry every American, that people have really lost faith in the democracy. I bet if you ask the average American, is our democracy working for you? And is it working, period? I don't know, but I'm guessing 8 out of 10 Americans would say maybe more. No, it's not working.
Yeah. And part of the words we use is we were working for a more perfect union. In other words, we've had this goal that, hey, it's not perfect yet. I mean, we still have racism here. We still have inequality here. We have somewhat of an arrogant, I think of a general arrogance about who we are, and we're special and so forth. And there's a lot of other places that have perfected their particular governments that we can learn from. I'm an admirer of the Nordic countries and what they do, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that downstream here. But I really think that we need to figure out how to look at ourselves and say, do we want to be like this? Do we want to be polarized? Do we want to be fighting? Do we want to have a government that doesn't get anything done because the lack of a common vision of where we want to go and how we need to go about that? So, I just wanted to say too, I was a fan of Thomas Jefferson too. In fact, I named my second son after Thomas Jefferson. He's our Tom. So anyway, just a side note here.
It's interesting. We don't go too deeply down this track, but you raise an important point, John, which is one of the things I think flaws in our character as Americans is we have so many great things, as you said. Is we've been so successful that we tend not to look to see what we can learn from others. So like we have the best medical system in the world, for example, in terms of if you're ill, it's probably no better place in the world to be if you're really ill than in the best American hospital. But our healthcare system is broken. And yet we don't want to learn from others, right? We used to be the envy of the world in terms of how our democracy ran. But, as I travel around the world now, I don't hear a lot of people in other democracies going, I wish my democracy was like yours. And the people of China rightly look at what's going on here and say, I'm not so sure this is a good fit. Maybe autocracy has some benefits. So, we'll get into some of that kind of higher level stuff, but let's go to the election for just a moment, because I know it's on people's mind. John, I know you've been involved in these last number of weeks very intensely on get out the vote efforts. Talk a little about your perspective on this particular election, what's at stake, and I'll let you go out on a limb. What do you think is going to determine what happens in these next few weeks?
Well,
I'm not asking you to predict what's going to happen, but what do you think is going to happen in these next few weeks that's going to make a difference? So first, your overall perspective on this particular election, and then what you think needs to happen these next few weeks.
Yeah. Well, I think those of us who pay attention, I suppose, and are aware, we reflect back of how we felt in 2016 when we suddenly had this man who has flawed character as our president. And we saw what happened thereafter, and we couldn't wait till, oh my God, when are we going to get this behind us? And it spurred us on to really take on in a more serious way the election of 2020. And it was, and we also saw that we had an insurrection on our hands, and we started to realize that our democracy needs to be protected, that it's not that solid, it's fragile. And that means that we need to, each of us as informed citizens who can work on this, get busy and work toward preserving our democracy. Not that it's perfect, but we know what autocracies are like. We don't want to be like China or Russia. They have some advantages, but no, most of the freedoms we have, we wouldn't be having if we had governments like that. That's the first thing, that we need to protect our democracy, and it's at stake here. And some of the stuff that the now Republican Party, such as it is, has not, they have gone into a cult, almost a cult-like thing. And it's very worrisome for us. But we also, part of that, we realize, or we have to think about, well, why is this? Why do half of our countrymen, why are they attracted to that? What is it that we have not done to serve all the people here? And so everybody feels like they have a fair shot, and that's what everybody should have, and why is it that some have that and some don't? And they feel left behind, and they felt unappreciated, unwanted, whatever that may be. And it causes them to say, we just want somebody to raise hell and put all these elites in the place or something like that. I don't know.
There's always this question about whether the person in leadership theory, there's this theory of great person versus great times. In other words, is it the person or is it the time that produces the person? So it's always interesting to ask, what is this time that has produced this person, right? And part of it, I remember in the first time when he was running in 2016, being on an airplane, and, I'll say I voted for Hillary Clinton, not have a problem saying that. And I sat next to a guy, Trump was just running then in the North Carolina primary. So he wasn't even the president, going to be the candidate yet. And I sat next to a guy in an airplane. We were about to eat. And I said, so who'd you vote for, if you don't mind? Well, I voted for Trump. And I said, well, I'm really excited to sit with you because I'm just curious. I want to understand why you did. And one of the things he said to me, which was very telling, is he said, I just think the whole system is broken. It's corrupt. It's like nothing gets done. And it's time to send a missile like over the wall. Right. So I think one of the things that attracted people to Trump the first time was that the idea of an outsider coming into, the lack of trust they had in this broken, divided, gridlocked system. The second thing is middle class angst. And this is what's really driving populism across the world is while the middle class in the developing world, their life is better than it was 15 years ago, but the life of the middle class in the developed world is less good than it was 15 years ago. The houses are less affordable, things are more expensive. And so I think you put those two things together, and it's part of what explains the original phenomenon. I agree with you. The enduring appeal of him, given his character, is a bit of a mystery at times. Alon, let's bring you in here. But I think that the last thing I'll say about that is I couldn't vote for Donald Trump because of his character. Actually, some of his policies, I think, are better than the Democratic policies. A lot of them I don't agree with. But the fact that he did what he did, and he was a sore loser and couldn't admit he won the election and then tried to steal it, and just his demeaning, divisive nature is just not what we need in this time. And that's why I'm so against him. But I am intrigued about his enduring appeal, even to people of character, which is kind of, I don't really fully get it. So Alon, let's bring you into the conversation.
Yes, thank you, John. I am a Frenchman. I'm still a Frenchman. I didn't choose to become American, even though I immigrated to this country 40 years ago. But I remember that my first contact with America was at the time of the Cuban crisis. And I fell in love with America and its democracy at the time, because we were dealing with an autocratic government on the other side. What has happened for me is comparing also the evolution of France and the United States. Mm-hmm. We are threatened in France with the same kind of far-right domination out of despair by many people who see, as part of the middle class, for instance, that their fate and the fate of their children is not what they thought it would be. So I think, and I would say maybe a second aspect is the role of technology and the role of money. I think some of the social networks have actually reinforced a sort of closed loop perspective on the part of many people. And some of the institutions, like the church, has radicalized itself, have radicalized themselves, and possibly also led people to lose some critical judgment capacity. So I'm looking at the larger perspectives that exist not only in this country, maybe with the greatest acuity at this time, but also exist in France, exist in a number of countries. Yes, to mention, John, the Scandinavian countries, they are an exception in Europe. The Italians, the Spaniards, the French are having their problem with also what democracy really means and how can we govern ourselves in a way that enhances the common good. So that's where I'm coming into this, and I measure the acuity of what is happening now, but it's symptomatic of something that is a larger emergence in the world.
I think about our start in America and the role that France provided in helping us get started, and Lafayette and all the heroes that we grew up learning about, and so. It's really, it's pleasant. I don't know the right word here is to have your perspective, and also to have I guess I would say the affection that exists between Americans and Frenchmen, and because of that, and the fact that the wars. The European wars that we've been involved in, and our support back and forth to each other. And we need to identify the good things and celebrate those from time to time. So I just wanted to put that in there, that part of working for a better union is working for a better world. And when people get along with each other, different cultures, but still appreciating each other in that way, I think that's something that we really want to honor and respect and celebrate. So
I want to come back to some of these bigger things. By the way, I was smiling, John, when you talked about the the support the French gave for the American Revolution kind of backfired on them a decade later, 15 years later when the French Revolution happened. But they were on the right side of history. They just didn't know it was going to backslap them too. Let's get to this election. Then I do want to come back to this bigger picture stuff. So, John, this is obviously going to be a very close election in every way. Close in the Senate, close in the Congress, close,
yes.
So much focus on the presidency, but it's going to be close everywhere. What are some of the things that you guys are doing in your Get Out the Vote effort to make sure that people get out and have their voices heard? In the last election, only 2 out of 3 Americans who were eligible to vote wound up participating. So talk a little about that and how some of that work may be focused in different parts of the country as well.
Well, we're a small organization, Elders for Sound Democracy, and so we have to pick where we can work and be effective. One of the groups that we started working with in actually 2018 it's a group called the Environmental Voter Project. And it turns out that environmentalists are not regular voters, which is really counterintuitive. This organization, they're really good at big data analysis, and they were able to identify people who would put climate change or environmental issues as their number one issue that affects how they think about our government and what it should be doing and so forth. And they identified 15 million environmentalists that are irregular or not voting. And so they established an organization to really reach out to those folks, and whether it's by phone calls or postcards or whatever it may be, to urge them to vote. And they developed a process and they got the statistics, and they see that if you ask a person to vote or urge them to vote between 5 and 7 times, they'll end up voting. And if they are urged to do it time and time again, they become regular voters. And so of this initial number, they have converted over 1 million of them into regular voters. And so it's a process that, they welcome our help coming as a group of elders to say, hey, we can bring some elders to help you do that. And so we picked that up. And so we've been doing that as an organization since 2018. The one that we started with for the 2022 election is a different organization called the Civic Center. And it's a group of women lawyers in Los Angeles that got onto the fact that high school seniors, when they turn 18, they are eligible to vote. And they did some data analysis and found that, less than 30% of them actually do vote. And then they did some experiments, and they also found that if you get them registered, then that 30% becomes 80%, something like that. If they're registered, they're going to vote, because part of registering, they're going to get some education about why it's important to vote. And so they set up a process of working with high schools. My wife and I got involved in that here where I live in Truckee, California. And the way it works is you go in and you find somebody in the faculty who has a connection with the senior class, and you work with the Civic Center to set up a voter registration project for that school and work on the high school seniors. And so we've taken that on. And that's one that is not just every election year, it's every year. Because every year there's a new class of seniors in high school. And part of it is establishing relationships with the high school and the faculty in the high school. And then it's not the faculty that runs the process of registration. It's the high school classes, the leadership, the senior class leadership, they do the work in actually getting young people registered. And we're there to mentor and support. And it's our way of working with younger people. And, when we talk about what's the role of the elders, that's definitely one, is to working with the younger people and helping them. And in many cases now providing some of the opportunities that we had earlier that are not there now. to get involved with the voting process. And so that's been a lot of fun. And it carries on to not only our high schools that we are local, but we start thinking about our family and our friends' families and where they are. And let's get those young people registered to vote. So that's another group that we've really focused on, and we've done a lot of work there. And then a third one that we just started this year is a group called Center for Common Ground. And it's a group that works on helping suppressed minorities vote. And we started our work there in Florida this year. We're working with, there's a group of Black women that are connected with this group, and we help that group, Center for Common Ground, contact each one of the women, make sure they're registered to vote, talk about how they're being suppressed and how to get around that. If they get rid of the voting boxes for your neighborhood, well, find out where the one is that you can get to. And if you need transportation there, do it, or maybe vote early. Make sure if you can vote by mail, take advantage of that sort of thing. But one of the things we've done is set up state teams, and I happen to be co-leading the Arizona state team, so got really familiar with that. And so in Arizona, it's the Latino population and plus the Native Americans. And so I got myself writing postcards to people living in the reservations, making sure that they figure out how to vote. Sometimes they have to drive 2 miles or 2 hours. I mean, just to get some fresh water or get to a post office and things like that makes it hard for them. And so we need to help them being able to vote too. So we're making inroads into the people that really need help, and whether they're reluctant, like the environmentalists, or they don't know that they ought to vote, like young people or people that are really suppressed in their voting, and how to get around that. So that's what we're doing.
And of course, if you want to get involved, Elders Action Network, Elders Climate Action, you can go to the websites, and it's not too late, in these next few weeks to get involved in postcards or calling. And it's a great reminder too, that this election is there's so much focus on swing voters, this small group of people who change their mind, so to speak, at the last minute. But in fact, mostly the election is determined by who turns out the vote. So to a great extent, this election, like most close elections, is really going to be determined by who gets the vote out. And if voters who have environmental bias and environmental values and vote that way get out, the election's likely to go one way or the other. And most people forget that turnout is as or more important than changing people's minds. It's really hard to change people's minds. Not many people change. I don't know too many people who change their mind, to be honest, about anything, sadly. Like, the average person changes their mind maybe twice a year about something, and maybe it's a restaurant they go to rather than their politics. So I think I really applaud what you guys are doing. And I loved we had Nathaniel Stinnett from the Environmental Voter Project on a few episodes ago this summer. So, hey, if you're listening to this one, you might want to listen to that one too. But I loved you reminded us that a person who doesn't vote, or maybe is inclined not to vote, just being encouraged 5 to 7 times. So if you know anyone in your life, and again, I believe in sound democracy, and a good democracy means everyone gets a voice. So you may not agree with my politics, but if you want your candidate to win, talk to people who may not vote. You don't have to go through us necessarily or through an organization. Encourage them to vote. Make sure everyone you know and love and care about is going to vote. And especially, as you said, young people. I have 2 millennial daughters, and, I think that, one of those environmental groups that is least likely to vote are young people. The other are people in marginalized communities. If you got some young people in your life, and a lot of us as elders do, and you want this election to go the way you want it to go, well, you better reach out to those young people in your life and ask them if they're going to vote. Encourage them to do so.
So, John, Elders for Sound Democracy also has an initiative on the role of money in politics. Could you say a little more about that? What you have actually explored in that domain?
Right. Elder Sound Democracy has three main goals, if you will. The first one we've been talking about, and that is the right to vote and getting out the vote, which is what our primary focus has been on this year. The second one, I would call it our fighting for our rights and freedoms, like our right to be safe from gun violence, our women's rights for reproductive, freedom, that sort of thing. The third one is is the essence of what we would like to call a sound democracy. And right now, our Supreme Court in 2010 passed what's called, I forget the name right now. Anyway, it basically said that we can spend as much money as we want to on affecting how politicians act. And there's what that has done is open up the door for all kinds of dark money affecting how our politicians vote and so forth. And Citizens United, it was the name of what I was trying to find here. Right now, there's a group called Move to Amend. And Move to Amend, the only way we can turn off what the Supreme Court decided was to amend our Constitution. And this move to amend the Constitution has two facts to it. Number one is that money is not free speech, number one. And the other one is corporations do not have the same rights as people do. A corporation is not a person. So those two principles are what move to amend is. And there's a long process to amend the Constitution. You have to get Congress all deciding, or I think it's 2/3 of the Congress have to do it, and then 3/4 of the states have to approve that. And so amending the Constitution is not something you do in 1 year. But so we support that Move to Amend organization. The other thing is and here's a thing is why working in the state level is important. And I'll talk about where I live in California. We have a supermajority legislature as well, a Democrat, and yet our California state is a big oil producer and natural gas. And for us who worry about our climate, we have to shut all that down. But right now, the oil industry has tremendous amounts of money to work with. They use the full power of that Citizens United ruling. And they donate money, get money to each of our state legislators. And so you would think California gets the reputation of being very forward in terms of working toward climate action and the right legislation and so forth. Well, we make incremental steps there, but we could be so much better, much further along if there were regulations in place where legislators, you might call it a conflict of interest. When one of the leading guys of one of our committees, key committees in our state legislature, gets $700,000 a year from the oil industry. And so that person is a good Democrat, supposedly, make sure that progress is going to be very, very slow. And, it has to almost use some other criteria to have that man being influenced. And so we have our work cut out for us in the corruption that big money causes. And it also keeps a lot of good citizens from being able to run for Congress or being in our government because they can't afford it. It takes too much money if they're running against, a billionaire, for example. So we are aware of that. And so what we do, Alon, is educate. And education is behind everything that we do, and it's in-depth education. And the other thing that we try to do is learn how to communicate effectively. It's one thing to know what the right thing to do is. The other is, how do you tell your fellow citizen what's going on and why it's important that we vote in a way or write letters to our members of Congress or protest or whatever mechanisms that we might use to create influence. And so, the big money is a huge problem that it's not consistent with having a sound democracy.
Yeah, and sadly, as you said, John, the path to solve that now is very long and a long shot in the short run because amendments will be very hard to pass now in America, and there's so much vested interest. But I think one of the ways we can counter that too, whatever your means are, millions of small donors can have an impact. So you may think, does my donation matter? Well, small donors can counter some of that big dark money, and that's one way we can take action right now. You may think, oh, my $5 or $10 doesn't matter, but it does matter because if millions of people give $5 or $10, you can really counter some of that dark money in the short run. It raises this is like a big, hairy one, but one of my real questions about our democracy is really that the vast majority of Americans now say neither party represents them. And our two-party system is kind of like the elephant in the room. No pun intended, given the GOP has the elephant as their, it's the elephant and the donkey in the room, right? I remember Van Jones, who I like a lot. Although Trump just called him a sleazebag. And I was thinking, I'd love Trump to attack me. That would be like a nice badge of courage. So congratulations to you, Van, that, right. that Trump went after you and called you a sleazebag. I think he's a pretty upstanding guy. But they were talking about immigration about maybe a year ago. And Van Jones said something that really struck me, which I think is true. He said, sadly, neither party wants to solve immigration because they want to run against each other on immigration. And I thought it was a really insightful point. Now, some Democrats may disagree. I actually think Van Jones is right. And one problem with our two-party system, especially in this age of polarization and where people get attacked the moment they try and compromise, is people are forced into these artificial positions. Like Fareed Zakaria in his latest book, which is a great read, has a great quote in there about like these populist movements. He said, not his quote, it's from someone else. It said, so long as progressive politicians insist that only fascists control the border, democracies will continue to elect fascists. So I thought it was a great point, right? So we get into these ridiculous ideas, defund the police versus like Black Lives Matter, close the border, open the border, right? Get rid of all guns, let guns be everywhere. So the two-party system has driven not only polarization, but to me, like the eradication of common sense. That I think it's really is an elephant in the room, is that I think neither party has a lot of vested interest in solving problems, because you run on problems and you run on the fact that someone else created a problem that you can fix. And I don't know how we're going to get around that. It isn't like a third party white knight candidate, but I think it's going to happen to me from within the parties. Is that I've often thought we ought to have like a common sense middle party that emerges, and some are Republicans, some are Democrats, and we run as a block. But I don't know how you break this logjam, but it's kind of, to me, a big elephant in the room. The two-party system has outserved its function, and more oil was drilled during the Biden administration than during the Trump administration. And that's not an accident, because I still think the Democrats are better for the environment, but this is a problem. And you pointed out in California as well, it's not just about money. It's about winning it's all about winning elections. Yeah. And to win elections, you have to run against someone. And often that means your common sense goes out the window.
Yeah. Well, a good example of that are Kamala Harris, who is now all of the above when it comes to what kind of energy should we have. She used to be against fracking. And this was pointed out in an article just this week by David Brooks, saying that neither party is for one set of values and positions. They mix it up so that they kind of want to be in the middle and taking a stand on whether we should be creating more natural gas by fracking so that we can, dominate the world with economic value of that at this point, knowing that it's absolutely the wrong thing we should be doing if we're really serious about taking on climate change. I mean, it's, people ask this question, or I've heard this, that nobody's talking about climate change. Neither candidate is talking about climate change. Well, one reason is it's because they don't hear it enough. That people, the two candidates and other candidates for other races hear about immigration, they hear about the economy, and they only act and talk about things that the voters are talking about to them. And turns out climate change is down 10th or lower in people when they say, what are you most interested in? So part of it is we need to educate more and more people about how serious climate disruption is. And with the hurricanes we just saw, the wildfires, the extreme temperatures, there's no question anymore if it's real or not. It is real, and it's on top of us right now, and we ought to be talking about that, and we ought to be electing legislators and administrators that are going to really take it on. And I think it's really unfortunate that what you're talking about here is that people trying to do something in the middle, a little bit of everything for everybody, and it doesn't work. We've got to, well, anyway, we're talking about what does it mean to be a sound democracy here.
Yeah. And here's one of the things it means to me, and then Alon, I want to bring you in, is one of the things Bernie Sanders said the first time he ran that really struck me is he said, we need a new American revolution. And people said, what does that mean? Well, what he meant by that was the citizens have to be involved all the time. So I'm all for the next few weeks, get out the vote, talk to people, who tell them who you're voting for, get involved, write letters, do postcards. But November 7th or 10th, whoever wins, that's when the citizens' job then begins again. I remember years ago in British Columbia, where I spent half my time, the other half in California, the former premier, when he was running the first time, Gordon Campbell, asked this question at this group I was at of business leaders. He said, why do politicians not keep their promises? Then he answered his own question. He said, it's because you let us. The moment the election is over, you're not engaged until the next election comes. So we kind of do what we want to do, and then 4 years again, we run again. So how do we get involved day to day, contacting our politicians, being involved in media, having our voice out there, giving money to the things that we care about, to lobby, to counter all the money that lobbies the things we don't want to happen? And so we have to look in the mirror as citizens is the point, right? Our job is not done on November 6th or whatever the election day is. We got a job to do before then, but we got to be citizens all the time. And that's part of the way this is going to change. Alon, come on in here, please.
Well, I completely agree that the two-party system has locked us up into an either or and not necessarily finding something that makes a lot of sense for the future. So yes, there is a very urgent need to reaffirm democracy as a possibility. But then beyond that, for instance, the capacity for politicians to challenge growth for growth's sake, which brings us to climate change. Because by pursuing unlimited growth, we create the consequences, and we see them more and more now. So I hope that if democracy is preserved, there will be room for a larger debate as to what kind of society do we want to be, and how much does our search for happiness depends on pursuing the kind of growth that we have pursued in the last 100 years or so. So that's my hope and my prayer, that it will actually open up new possibilities once the danger of autocracy is past us, that there will be a larger debate. And in the habits of the heart, or in healing the heart of democracy, Parker Palmer insists on the capacity for good citizens to be able to hold opposites and find a solution in life-giving ways, which means positive for the future, that actually will not block evolution, political evolution. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that I'm curious and eager about. It's to see the possibility of questioning some of the fundamentals on which both parties have thrived until now.
I think about what Bernie Sanders stood for, more what he calls himself a socialist. His socialist ideas are, I think, some of them are really good ideas. We have the other thing I think about myself. I was brought up in a very conservative neighborhood of rural Iowa, and small, farmers and small storekeepers kind of thing. They were all basically private business people, and balancing the budget was very much a part of what they did. You don't need to spend more money than what you have to spend, and you don't get yourself in deep trouble with making big loans that you'll never be able to pay off, kind of thing. And yet our nation is doing that. It's just crazy what we're doing. And from my point of view, and I've been thinking about that, is I'm sort of as I've been carried away with the liberal movement, if you will. But I should stop and think about, well, what are the values that I was brought up with, and maybe and not only myself, but other people. I've been contacted with some old high school class members of mine who live in Iowa. Iowa's a very red state now, and I have all the opportunity in the world to go back and reach out and say, okay, let's talk. Let's talk about what are your values, that get past the anger and that not being taken care of, or thought of the flyover. Those are flyover kind of they're really we have some really bad manners, if you will, how we treat each other in this country. And talk about what are some of the points of view of the conservatives that we ought to reconsider, and maybe that's what you call holding both sides, or carrying both sides, so we can see values in each other's positions, and not make a big fight out of that. Is just say, okay, what's the right thing at this point for the good of the common good? How do we get ourselves in the position where we're not thinking about ourselves so much, but more about what's the common good that we should strive for? And then I would like to say too, I think we ought to pay attention to the Nordic countries. I think they have somehow gotten themselves into a situation where the equality is much better there. They get a lot of social services that, boy, I wish we all had those in our country, and they're happy. They're happy about it. They're not angry. They see the value of that, and they're proud of it. So I'm going to be doing some writing about that, and try to get a conversation like that started.
I'm going to talk about that in just a second, John. I want to pick up on that. One of the things I think would be wonderful, it fits with something you were saying, Alon, and you, John, is wouldn't it be great if we could have some around the table conversations across America and roll that up into just what did we learn? Could do that easily now in the age of the internet. Mm-hmm. AI could tell us what all those conversations led to if we recorded them, right? Which is, what do we want for the future of our country? And one of the things I noticed in Canada, again, because I live in both countries, the biggest thing I learned in Canada is, like, the federal election lasts 4 to 6 weeks. That's how long the election campaigning goes on. And one of the real other dysfunctional things in America is, on November 7th or whenever 30th, whenever somebody finally surrenders, or at least the Supreme Court says they have to surrender, whatever happens, right, is we'll start fighting the next election.
Yes.
So and wouldn't it be wonderful if whoever wins, if we could just step back and have some conversations, as you said, John, civil conversations about what do we want? Because probably some of the things we want are not that different, right? There's some things we would disagree on, but like, I wish we could find a way to talk about the future in the way you were talking about, Alon. And that's where, again, this elections media cycle we're in, CNN and Fox will be replaying the next election the moment this one is over. And it's not good for us because there's no time for us to have these kind of civil conversations. But here's what I would say is you can start it where you are. Whoever wins, your side or the other side, or maybe you don't have a side, you think it's all gone to crap, is start to have those conversations, at least with your network, and say, let's not talk about who won or who should have won. What do we want? And how can we create a more civil dialogue? It'd be great if we could start those kind of conversations. Hey, John, I want to pick up on what you said. You casually mentioned writing. I want to write up some of that stuff. You've had kind of really two big iterations in your life. I mean, I'm sure there's much more nuance there, but you started and founded a business that was successful, sold that business, did some soul searching, and founded the Elders Action Network. Is there a next phase coming for John? You're not the head of the thing anymore. Is there something you imagine, a next chapter for you, even though you'll still do some of the stuff you're doing now? Is there something on your mind as you think about a next chapter for you?
Well, I'll have to say I'm pondering that question a lot, and I can say, well, I like to communicate. I'm kind of a scholar at heart. I think about good leadership. What is good leadership? I am interested. I was a member of the Toastmasters Club for years, and part of it is about public speaking, but there's this equal part about leadership. And there's a lot of good course material on what it takes to be a good leader. So I've been thinking about creating a leadership 101 course that to provide that. And I would, I like to lead things, and so I could lead something like that. And I would, the part of the exercise too for me is to let go and say, okay, it's someone else's turn to take over and be the leader. And my role needs to be maybe a communicator and a teacher, an advisor, that sort of thing. But I haven't really locked in on what that is yet, and I'm sure I'm not worried about it. I come to realize that life is a series of stepping over thresholds into the unknown. And, it's like when you get married, you don't know what you're getting into, but you do it because that's the thing you do. And so taking a new job or starting something, starting Elders Action Network, I had no idea what it was like to lead volunteers, because I was used to leading people who are paid to do what they were supposed to do, what the job description was, and that was much easier in retrospect. And so, learning all the time, I'm a lifelong learner, and I appreciate being able to do that. And I'm looking at it as, okay, here's the next threshold, and I don't know exactly what that's going to be, but I know I'm ready to do that, and I got to tell myself, let go and take that step.
Yeah, that's great. And John, certainly thank you for your life's work. And if anyone's listening or watching and says, how do you stay young? That's how you stay young. You keep asking, what's next for me? And I think of my friend Francis Hesselbein, who died 2 years ago now, who revitalized the Girl Scouts of America, then ran the Peter Drucker Foundation, Leadership Foundation, and died, I think, at like 105 or something like that. And my friend, our mutual friend Sally, happened to mention the word retirement to Francis. And of course, she was like maybe in her 60s, and Francis was already like in her late 90s or something. And Francis said, shh. She said, Sally, for people like us, there's no such thing as retirement. We're going to serve until the pine box is closed on top of us. And it's a great kind of, not the pine box, not a great image, but serving until then. And John, I suspect you're going to serve till the pine box is closed on top of you. So good for you. Alon, give you a final word, and then I'll close us out.
Yes, thank you, John, for evoking that letting go as a way to continue growing, actually. And as an elder, I think this is something that opens up new possibilities. Yes, we build possibly on what we've done before, but opening up and being inspired is actually very critical. And I hope this happens to a number of people who are in their senior years, elders years, that they see that there is that opening, that becoming actually a conduit through which some new possibilities emerge. So thank you, John.
So just in closing, a couple of things stand out to me. First of all, obviously, these next few weeks are going to be really important in terms of this election. And whatever your view is, get involved. Make sure you vote. Talk to other people about how you're going to vote and why. If there's people in your life who may not vote, ask them if they're going to vote. Have the courage to do that. Don't stand on the sidelines. Nothing worse than come the day after election, you think, I wish I had done more. So get involved. Don't stand on the sidelines. And then, as we've been saying, and then after this election, whatever way it goes, be involved in helping to reimagine our democracy. I think the one thing all three of us agreed on today is that our democracy is not healthy. It's got issues of money and polarization and lack of civility. It's gridlocked. It doesn't really go for big ideas. And I think we're all struggling with how to solve that. But we ought to stay with that question. It's a really important question. And I go back to that Jefferson quote, for a democracy to thrive, there really has to be another revolution every 20 to 30 years. And I think it's time for one in America, not one that has violence at its core, but one that has true citizenship and engagement and civility at its core, so we can make that more perfect union. But meanwhile, we want to thank you, our listeners. That's why we're here. If you love what you heard, please share it and share it widely. We'd love to hear from you, just to tell us what you think. And if you like for us to cover another subject or have another guest, please let us know. As we always end this podcast, at election time, a great time to remind you that history is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. What people will someday call history, including this coming January, will be determined by what we do right now in these next few weeks. So we'll see you next time on The Way Forward. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Their dedication to empowering elders to take action on climate change and social justice issues is truly inspiring. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. To learn more about our sponsors and get involved, visit Elders Action Network at eldersaction.org and Elders Climate Action at eldersclimateaction.org. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.